Welcome back to Sovereign Senior Finance, to our esteemed silver generation, the builders, the quiet architects of modern Canada, and the stewards of our nation's legacy. Thank you for joining me today. You have lived through market crashes, geopolitical realignments, and shifting cultural tides. You possess a wealth of lived experience that cuts through the noise of daily news cycles. Today, we are going to speak candidly about a global reality that directly impacts your hard-earned stability, your legacy, and the economic world you will leave to your children and grandchildren. Consider this paradox. On March 16, 2023, French Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne stood before the National Assembly to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64. Knowing she lacked the votes, she invoked Article 49.3 of the French Constitution, bypassing Parliament entirely. She triggered the largest protests in 3 decades. 7,000 tons of garbage piled up on the boulevards of Paris, refineries halted, 8 unions marched together. She paid a political price that ended her career to force this bill into law. Yet, here is the geopolitical riddle. Why would a world leader commit political suicide to fix a pension system that, mathematically, wasn't actually fixed? 3 months later, France's own Council on Pensions published a report revealing that despite the riots, despite the political immolation, the system will not balance for a single year between now and 2070. The deficit will only grow. This brings us to the most urgent question for anyone holding a Canadian passport and relying on a state promise for their twilight years. If the sovereign states of Europe and the United States are mathematically breaking under the weight of their own promises, what does this mean for your old age security, your Canada pension plan, and the future purchasing power of your life savings? Today, we are going to look strictly at the math, the history, and the quiet preparations Western governments are making right now to break their promises without ever admitting it. The founding illusion: a political weapon, not a retirement plan. To understand why every Western pension system is mathematically broken, we must look at what their founders originally intended. The truth is far from the utopian ideal of a state-funded multi-decade vacation. In Berlin on June 22, 1889, Otto von Bismarck signed the world's first state pension into law. The retirement age was set at 70. The average German life expectancy at birth that year was just 40. A typical German baby had less than a 1 in 3 chance of ever collecting a single mark. Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, was not building a compassionate retirement system. He was building a political weapon. He admitted that a man with a pension prospect is far easier to handle than one without. It was a calculated bribe to steer the working class away from socialism. In London, in 1908, Winston Churchill championed the Old Age Pensions Act. The retirement age was again 70, paying just 5 shillings a week, heavily means-tested, and average male life expectancy was 47. Churchill remarked that 5 shillings was not much, unless you did not have it. When Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the American Social Security Act in 1935, setting the age at 65, the payroll tax was a mere 1% on the worker and 1% on the employer, capped at the first $3,000 of wages. And here is the foundational mathematics that made it work. In 1945, when the first major wave of beneficiaries began collecting, there were 42 American workers paying into the system for every one retiree drawing out. This was the founding bargain. Bismarck, Churchill, and Roosevelt built insurance policies against the incredibly rare event of a long old age, functioning in societies where the young, working population vastly dwarfed the elderly. It was a microscopic redistribution. The chain letter and the demographic collapse. A pay-as-you-go pension system is, at its core, a chain letter. Today's workers pay today's retirees. The system functions exclusively as long as the next generation is vastly larger than the last, or exponentially more productive. When the demographic chain breaks, the math shatters. Let us trace that 42 to 1 American ratio. By 1950, it fell to 16. By 1960, down to 5. By 1980, 3.2. Today, it sits at 2.7, and the trustees project it will hit 2.2 by 2050. The European arithmetic is infinitely darker. Italy currently stands at 1.5 contributors per pensioner. France is at 1.7, and Germany at 1.8. The OECD projects that by 2054, for every 100 working-age adults, there will be 76 people over the age of 65 in Italy and Spain. South Korea offers a chilling glimpse into the fast-forwarded future. With a catastrophic birth rate of 0.75 and Seoul itself at 0.64, far below the replacement rate of 2.1, the United Nations projects that by 2060 dependents will outnumber working-age Koreans. This is not a speculative forecast, it is undeniable arithmetic. Western governments have known this for decades, and they have attempted 3 fixes, none of which have worked. First, they tried raising contributions. In Germany, the payroll tax is already 18.6%. To keep the system solvent until 2070, the Bundesbank calculates they would need to hike it to 29%, an economic death sentence no government will impose. Second, they tried cutting benefits outright. Italy attempted this with the Dini reform in 1995 and the Fornero reform in 2011. Labor Minister Elsa Fornero literally broke down in tears announcing the cuts, which were eventually rolled back by populist politicians who prioritized votes over mathematics. Third, they raised the retirement age. This is the universal path of least resistance. France pushed it to 64, the UK to 68 by the mid-2040s, and Denmark to 70. In the United States, the 1983 Greenspan Commission under Ronald Reagan bought the system exactly 40 years of solvency. That solvency evaporates in 2033. The official 2025 Trust Fund report confirms that in 2033, the law will trigger an automatic, immediate 23% benefit cut. For a retired American couple, that translates to a sudden annual loss of $1,700. The unfunded liabilities are staggering. American economist Lawrence Kotlikoff estimates the U.S. Social Security shortfall at $61 trillion in present value. Germany's unfunded liability across pensions and healthcare is a jaw-dropping 454% of its GDP, nearly 19.5 trillion euros. Italy already spends 16% of its total GDP just keeping its pensioners paid. The 3 patterns of the broken promise governments cannot keep their promises, so the question evolves from if the promise will break to how it will be broken. History reveals 3 quiet, devastating patterns we must prepare for over the next decade. Inflating the benefit-away states rarely announce cuts. They let inflation do the dirty work. In the U.S., the Standard Consumer Price Index is used for cost of living adjustments, but an experimental index for the elderly, which heavily weights medical care, runs higher. Over a 25-year retirement, this invisible gap erodes roughly 8% of real lifetime purchasing power. In fact, American retirees who began collecting in the year 2000 have lost 36% of their buying power. In the UK, the triple lock guarantee is now costing £15.5 billion extra per year, prompting conservative leaders to openly admit it is bankrupting the country. Means testing the prudent. Australia offers the canonical example of this stealth confiscation, originally a universal benefit. Today, 40% of Australians over 67 receive absolutely nothing. The government aggressively tapers benefits based on external income and assets, essentially punishing those who saved responsibly. We saw a flash of this in the UK recently, when Chancellor Rachel Reeves abruptly restricted the winter fuel payment, stripping it from millions overnight by quietly moving from a universal benefit to a means-tested clawback, pushing the age past. Healthy expectancy. This is the cruelest method because it disproportionately penalizes the working class. In the UK, healthy life expectancy for men is 62.9 years, yet the pension age is rising past 66. A typical British man loses his health 4 years before the state pays him a dime. In deprived areas, they lose their health 9 years before eligibility. In America, Harvard and Princeton researchers found the life expectancy gap between the top 1% and bottom 1% is nearly 15 years. A Wall Street banker can comfortably retire at 65 and live to 90. A warehouse worker or a truck driver whose life expectancy peaked in 2010 and is now falling is effectively taxed for a benefit they will likely never live to enjoy. The precedence of confiscation. If you believe a sovereign state will simply print money to save you, look to recent history. Governments under extreme fiscal stress arrange events so the promise breaks itself. In Russia in 1992, the state kept its promise to pay fixed ruble benefits, but allowed inflation to reach 2009%. Bread prices rose 25-fold. Half of surveyed pensioners lost 5 kilograms of body weight, and male life expectancy plummeted by 6 years. The promise wasn't canceled, it was incinerated by inflation. In Argentina in 2008, the government nationalized $30 billion in private citizen retirement assets in a single stroke, disguising a sovereign debt monetization as the end of a failed private experiment. In Hungary in 2010, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán issued an ultimatum: transfer your private savings to the state treasury or lose all future state entitlements. 97% complied, instantly filling a $4 billion hole in the state budget. And in Cyprus in 2013, during the Eurozone bail-in, the state forcibly converted 47.5% of uninsured bank deposits over 100,000 euros into worthless bank equity. A 70-year-old retiree lost 43 years of working life savings in a single weekend, despite presidential promises to the contrary. This mechanism, the bail-in, is now codified in European and American banking law. The Canadian reckoning. What this means for the silver generation. Here is where the cold mathematics of Europe and America meet the reality of the Canadian border. Canada is currently attempting to outrun this demographic chain letter through hyper-aggressive immigration policies. By artificially inflating the working-age population, our policymakers are attempting to prop up the ratio of taxpayers to pensioners. But this is a temporary, highly volatile mathematical patch. It has placed catastrophic downstream pressure on our housing markets, our infrastructure, and the cost of living for your grandchildren. We are diluting the foundational wealth of the country to keep the 20th century pension machinery churning for one more generation. For the Canadian silver generation, the signs of stealth default are already here. Inflation at the grocery store and the gas pump is effectively acting exactly as it did in the Russian and American examples, quietly eroding the real-world value of fixed CPP and OAS payments. We already employ means testing through the OAS clawback, the recovery tax, which penalizes seniors who have dared to build independent income streams. It takes very little legislative imagination to see Ottawa drastically lowering the threshold for those clawbacks, following the Australian model, when the federal deficit becomes unmanageable. You paid into this system your entire working life. You held a promise from your government, but as we have seen historically, a pension was always a promise, never a binding contract, and promises do not survive arithmetic. The state pension as a primary retirement vehicle is merely a 120-year-old novelty. For thousands of years prior, the baseline for old age was the household, the family, and the retention of physical lifetime savings. Today's older citizens face a painful rewinding to that pre-Bismarck status quo. but with a tragic caveat. The multi-generational households and deeply entrenched family savings that insulated our ancestors have been culturally dissolved by the very government policies that promise to replace them. So, what is the actionable path forward for the Canadian senior? It requires a radical shift in how we define legacy. We must abandon the illusion that the state will be the ultimate guarantor of our family's futures. A pension is fundamentally a claim on someone else's future labor. As the pool of future labor shrinks, and as your grandchildren face an economy burdened by insurmountable sovereign debt and housing costs, that claim will inevitably be watered down. As Xenophon of Athens wrote in 362 BC in the Economicus, the world's first book on economics, true wealth is not merely gold in a vault or a digital IOU from a heavily indebted government. Wealth is the ability to make things produce. A horse is wealth to a man who can ride it. Land is wealth to a man who can farm it. Money itself is useless if you do not know how to deploy it productively. For the silver generation, true wealth moving forward means pivoting away from total reliance on state promises. It means structuring your assets, whether in hard real estate, productive equities, or generational trusts, in a way that cannot be easily means-tested or inflated away by Ottawa. More importantly, it means transferring not just capital, but the knowledge of production to your children. The arithmetic always wins. Governments will inevitably re-engineer the rules of the game to protect their own solvency. Your absolute best defense is to ensure that your wealth, your health, and your family's future are grounded in tangible, productive reality, entirely independent of a politician's hollow promise. Thank you for your time, your wisdom, and your attention today. Until next time, stay sovereign, stay vigilant, and protect your legacy.